Recording is on.
Welcome everyone to our session on JCI accreditation with MEG. I'm excited to have you with us today as we explore how MEG supports hospitals across the APAC region in achieving JCI accreditation. Our special guest today is Robert, who brings valuable insights from his experience working in private hospital focused on patient safety and compliance. Please note this session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with all attendees afterward. If you have any questions during the meeting, please feel free to type them into the chat and Robert will address these questions at the end of our discussion. So let's jump into our conversation with Robert. Robert, good morning.
Good morning and hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So listen,
go ahead. Sorry.
So I was just going to say, look, thank you all for attending. So really the scope of today is for me to switch hats from my current role as head of implementation here at MEG and go back to my former existence as data and quality manager at a high-tech hospital here in Dublin, where the hospital was focused on JCI and one of my roles was to aid certification. So I've been asked to help talk through how MEG aided and assisted on that journey.
Great. Could you start maybe by telling us a bit about your role in the private hospital and how IPSGs featured in your daily responsibilities?
Certainly be delighted to. So as suggested by my title, Data and Quality Manager, I was very much involved in looking at all the background data and ways of gathering that data and the governance of that data to support not only the clinical practices in the hospital, but also to maintain our alignment to the requirements of the JCI standard. And as you mentioned there, Mahmood, the international patient safety goals were particularly important. Obviously, they're at the forefront of the standard and they're there for a good reason. My focus on those when I took on the role at the hospital was to make sure that we had particularly clean ways of gathering that information, because understanding where you are with those international patient safety goals actually underpins a lot of the remaining chapters. I'm thinking here, for example, the management of high alert medications, International Patient Safety Goal 3, leads naturally into the MMU chapter and vice versa. So my first real task when I arrived was to expand actually the MEG suite, which when I arrived was covering ostensibly the practices of hand hygiene and insertions, UCC, PVC, etc. So very much focused on that cohort of interest. So very quickly, I determined that actually the international patient safety goals was something that we needed to get into MEG. And so I worked with the MEG team, having compiled a question set with the various heads of departments and chapter leads to come up with a set of questions that were able to then be turned very swiftly, it has to be said, into a set of standard audits that we used in MEG to start gathering that information and getting the wheels turning, and most importantly, getting the data back, which allowed me to use the data part of my job to see patterns and help drive improvements.
Great. And from your perspective, why are the IPSGs such a critical focus when it comes to patient safety and accreditation?
I think really it's because, as I said there a few minutes ago, they underpin an awful lot of what the rest of the standard chapters are looking for. If you get the basics right, then the rest should follow. And also, I mean, these are directives that have come up out of due consideration by the likes of the World Health Organization. There are things that actually also are true root causes for getting it right or getting it wrong. So the misidentification of a patient or the right identification has very significant outcomes for all parties concerned in the clinical journey.
Definitely. And before MEG was in a place, what were some of the main challenges you and your team faced in tracking and evidencing IPSGs?
The reason I'm laughing is that sometimes when you arrive in a place that's described as high tech, you realize actually there's an awful lot of paper, and that's what I encountered. So auditing and gathering information was still primarily on paper. We didn't have, at this point in time, by choice, it has to be said, an electronic patient record. So as you can see, there was a culture of paper, and that extended to any data gathering and the subsequent analysis. So everything that came across my desk was going to have to turn into Excel. So this was a significant challenge. It also meant that you've got variation in how people do things. People will take a view of a piece of paper or a set of questions that are not standardized or in a way that they can't adapt and put a particular twist on them. So the challenges were all those associated with a paper-based environment, trying to bring together a cohesive view of large data sets in order to see patterns. And particularly for the International Patient Safety Goals, the one that springs to mind most readily was actually International Patient Safety Goal 4, which is ensuring of safe surgery. So at this point in time, when I arrived, the audits were being conducted by a limited number of resources who were in fact theatre staff. Obviously, the primary job is to deal with patients in theatre. And also the audits were being split out, and it was becoming very difficult to combine all of the requirements of the standard, because there's actually three parts to that. There's the timeout, sign out, and site marking. So one of the first things I was to do was sit down with one of the senior theatre nurses and say, look, you're responsible for this auditing, and it is done by conducting 3 different audits. How would it be better if we put it all into one? To which she said, absolutely, it would be ideal, and we can actually get things more smoothly recorded. So I went to Meg and said, look, we have this situation where we've got 3 audits. Is there a way of bringing them together? Because ultimately, all the data is actually going to roll up to one particular measurable element or standard. But we still like to split out and have a look at the 3 separately. To which I was greeted, to my delight, with the reply, yes, we can. We can put it in as subforms, and we can put a selection at the beginning, which allows you to then, or the auditor, go and select which particular one you want, whether it be site, whether it be timeout, or whether it be sign out. But we can compile all the data for you and also split it out separately. And the turnaround time to getting these audits done under this new mechanism was the change in it rather was massively significant, particularly to the members of staff who indeed were in fact executing these audits previously. And I was delighted to say that actually the person who I would be referring to as the person I worked with became one of the lead champions and advocates for the adoption of MEG, and was actually instrumental in helping me drive forward other practices, changes in practice of auditing across a number of instances. Particularly, one that springs to mind is working with the CNSs who were looking after the patient assessment forms. Again, this advocate was in the room with me to help drive that adoption, and we turned the audits from paper, which were being conducted by 20 separate people, into something that was homogeneously conducted and reported on. So it was all very good stuff, really.
That's great. And thinking, when you first began using MEG, what difference did it make straight away in terms of visibility or ease of compliance?
Oh, well, for me personally, it absolutely went through like a knife through butter the amount of time I would spend otherwise building reports in Excel. It also meant that I knew that the data set itself was clean. One of the problems with Excel is you can get errors because people can enter stuff indiscriminately, but with the way that the audits were set up, there's a choice of answers you either select. Now, it's still person could put in the wrong answer, but it does remove interpretation and it does remove variation. So for me personally, it was the big step change initially was the ability to see data in reports in real or virtual real time. And this then meant the turnaround time for me being able to go out and communicate to the right people to say, look, these are the patterns we're starting to see, and therefore you need to start working with me to make the changes. That became condensed right down, and it meant that action happened earlier.
Great. And can you maybe share a specific example where having MEG in place made the difference during a tracer inspection or a review?
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the big ones that really springs to mind, it's a perennial problem in healthcare, is time, date, and signing. So, what happened was, and how this came to light, was that we moved into a position where we were able to create a chart audit, which is obviously part and parcel of the JCI standard. When they site visit, they will actually go through a number of charts looking for various requirements having been met. We were able to actually move that from paper-based audit into MEG. The fact that MEG allowed people to put in data and report in a rapid manner meant that we could see the patterns early. And one of the things that sprung out off the page, ironically enough, was the fact that there was not I'm going to say an issue, but there was a less than required adherence to time, date, and signing, which meant that my department, and particularly the head of patient safety, was able to then go and actually work with the basically the consultants responsible to say, guys, you need to actually start to improve on this. And we could see it by actual by a cohort of consultants as well as individual, which actually then, because of the way MEG had set up the patient medical record and audit, enabled us to then create individual reports that we could then use for credentialing and privileging. So there was a huge benefit that came off from what was really a simple activity of turning a paper-based audit for charts into MEG-based audit.
Great. Think about making a change. Usually, employees or staff are persistent towards change. So, how did frontline staff respond to MEG? Did it change the way they approached audit or compliance checks?
It most certainly did, and I'd like to say in a very positive way. I was conscious of the fact that, as you just mentioned there, that sometimes change brings it with it an attendant fear of additional governance and scrutiny, and that leads to resistance. And so I was conscious of that when we went round to start advocating the use of MEG. And as mentioned there about the incident where I had the member of staff from theatre who had taken up the surgical audit and then went on to help advocate to the CNSs, the nursing uh, patient assessment form. I went and worked with people who were able to then go and actually advocate to their peers and say, look, guys, this has made a real change to how I'm doing things. You know, it's not just what Robert's saying, it is actually here, and we are getting off paper, we are making this difference. And it was lovely to see that there was a natural upswell and take up and desire by people to move from the paper-based systems to MEG, because it just made things so much more efficient, effective, and easy to govern. So, for example, you imagine the joy of not having to wander around with a piece of paper, but you have an audit on a tablet or on a phone. It's just, yeah, there are more advantages than disadvantages. I think it was sort of, there was a degree of self-advocacy anyway with the product, and certainly a sense of the shock of the new, and it was wonderful, and people really wanted to get part of it. I mean, when I started, I mentioned there was a number of audits already in place, maybe 4 or 5. And very quickly, we got up to a situation where we have maybe 36 to 40 audits in play, all geared to things like the JCI standard, but also key areas of clinical governance. It actually got to a point where the advocacy took on a life of its own, and I had to introduce, which I was going to anyway, but I'd had to earlier than anticipated, a governance process, because there was a risk that actually we were going to overspend our budget, actually, and which is not a bad thing. It was obviously a great thing for MEG, for the hospital. There's a consideration that maybe we should actually just cool the jets a little bit and have a look and look at the value proposition before going ahead with everybody wanting to move everything off paper. You know, I think that spoke volumes, the fact that there was this desire to move everything off and be part of this new way of working.
Mhm. So, looking back at it, what concrete improvement did MEG help deliver in terms of compliance, reporting, or survey readiness?
Well, certainly from survey readiness, then this came back actually in the report, both formally and informally during the site registration recertification that took place in 2021. The JCI assessors were absolutely delighted at how clean the data was, the volume of what was able to be analysed and recorded, and just they saw that there was a definite desire to move and progress and improve things by moving away from paper to a system that actually allowed a very clear real-time reporting. The veracity of the data was more ensured. Also, things that were very important, actually, I remember demonstrating during the site visit, was the way that the MEG system underpinned the requirements for validation. So to produce a validation report was so much more simple and clean and effective. And the example I'll give you is when the first exercise I actually did in validation with a new audit, it was actually for cardiac arrest trolleys. So myself and the CNS responsible for looking after the 12 or so crash trolleys around the hospital actually walked the audit together. Now, because we had our independent accounts in MEG, after we completed our audit, I was able to run a very simple filtered report, pulling my audit results, pulling her audit results, and then we can compare the two, and there was a 90% positive beyond cross match, which meant, according to our validation process, there we are, we were actually now in sync. And those reports were able to be exported as PDFs and stored. And when it came to the validation, when it came to recertification, show this to the JCI assessor. Very simple. I mean, what it really helped with in terms of this concrete positives to our journey was that it just took out an awful lot of conversation when it came to proving that we, in fact, as a hospital and as a body of people, were actually not only following the requirements of the standard, but actually trying to exceed them. And there was the proof for it. And as they say, a picture paints 1,000 words, and there's nothing better than here's a report with all the data, and there's all the data if you wish to go back and look at it, which the assessors actually did. I mean, it was, as you remember, 2021 was an interesting year for everybody. We were still in the throes of COVID, and one of the things that I want to talk about in answer to your significant improvements and concrete changes relates to that. Prior to COVID, all of the feedback about quality improvements and changes and recommendations were printed on paper and put up on the various quality boards that were stationed around the clinic. However, COVID changed all that. I found myself going around putting stuff up, and then come back shortly to find it all no longer there, only to be told, well, we've taken all this down. We're trying to reduce the amount of tactile surfaces that people will then potentially transfer infection across. So fair enough. How then do we get around this? So what we were able to do then is actually work with MEG to come up with an electronic solution. And that solution was pretty simple, but quite brilliant in its own way, in terms of what it actually achieved. So working with MEG, it became clear that we could take the reports that we had been previously printing out, and we could actually, working with, create public dashboards that we could actually then feed into the hospital intranet. So this became a fantastic solution for us to be able to promulgate and share the information across the hospital readily, without contravening of the infection prevention situations in place and guards in place. So that made a significant concrete difference, because when the assessment took place, which, as I mentioned, took place in 2021, where we were still in the throes of COVID, we had this strange situation where we had external assessors not there in person, but actually being driven around as a tablet on a sort of like a robot body. Well, we had this electronic solution that sort of befitted that approach. And to the end, you see, we've already made huge step changes in promulgating and sharing the information out to the people who really need to know how particularly the international patient safety goals were going, because that's actually what we put out onto the intranet.
That's great. Just for colleagues listening today, uh, what advice would you give about making the most of MEG when you're preparing for external standards like the JCI?
A couple of things, actually. So first and foremost, engage. If you're the person responsible for the design of the audits and shaping the audit forms that come out to MEG, go and engage with your chapter leads. Go and work with them to determine those areas that they themselves feel aren't as strong as the others. I'm not saying we always look for the catastrophic areas or areas of weakness, but it would make sense to go and use your time wisely to go and shore up those areas by coming to MEG with those areas that you want to have some additional scrutiny on. Think about the reporting that you want. Design from reporting backwards. What is it you're trying to look for? And it also goes slightly contrary to the grain, but it's well meant. Don't necessarily just design for JCI. Think about the bigger picture piece. All JCI are doing is looking to make sure that you are actually cognizant of the bigger picture pieces. You asked me at the beginning why I thought that, what was why the impact and significance of the international patient safety goals. And it's exactly that. They are trying to drive at the bigger picture piece. Okay. So if you think about how your data is going to affect not only the adherence to a standard, but actually drives forward and benefits patient safety and clinical practice as an entity, that's what you should be really going for. And the best way to do that is go and have conversations with those people who are responsible for those particular measurable elements that may need to be strengthened up. Also, test your audits on your forms before coming to MEG. Go and actually walk, as the Japanese says, part of the quality piece, walk the gamut. Go actually walk it, make sure it makes sense. I mean, that was one of the beautiful things that also came out of the exercise of calibrating and validating the audit with the, which I mentioned there earlier, with the cardiac arrest trolley. As the quality person, not just the data person, as my roles too, I was able to have a look at the process and understand actually was that process as effective as it should be, and engender that discussion. And this was something actually that came out when we were looking at, with the head pharmacist, the International Patient Safety Goal 3, the improving the safety of high alert medication. So they came up with a series of steps with the audit form that we're working with myself, and we realized actually through the process of looking at the omnicells and looking at the way that certain of the electrolytes had been separated, there actually wasn't, there was still room for confusion. There was a discrepancy with actually, well, maybe we should be better over here or over there. Some people didn't have a clear idea, so that ambiguity was removed by having walked the audit before we put in the question set.
That's great. Thank you very much. And that's all from my side. I would like to keep a minute or two to just monitor if we have any more questions in the chat.
I just hope I haven't bored everyone to sleep. That's the main thing.
It was very informative and insightful, honestly.
Perfect.
Well, if no more question, then thank you everyone for joining us today. And a big thanks to Robert for sharing his valuable experience and practical insights on how MEG has helped in the journey toward JCI accreditation. We hope the session has given you useful perspective and actionable advice to support your own accreditation efforts. Remember, this recording of the webinar will be sent to you shortly, so you can revisit any part of the discussion. And if you have any further questions or want to connect after today, please don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great day and best of luck with your accreditation journey. Thank you.
Thank you all.